Vina, welcome. Thanks for being with us. So you specialize in employment law and independent or contract employees. Do you have concerns about the growing industry surrounding youth influencers?
Absolutely. I think that we're in a moment where it's hard for people to differentiate between what is work on these platforms like YouTube and Instagram, and what is sort of entertainment or play or just recording your everyday life. And as a result, a lot of the things that are happening on these platforms, performances by children or just recordings of children, are going unregulated. And so some children are actually generating income either for themselves or their families, for their parents, or even for other entities, but that income is not being regulated, so we don't know who it's going towards, whether it's going to the benefit of the child. And we also have a lot of concerns, or I have a lot of concerns about how the images of these children are being used by third parties. How are their images being used, for example, in terms of being scraped for artificial intelligence? And what does consent mean in this context? Do children have the ability to consent to having their images used in these ways?
Specifically, what kinds of protections do you think should be in place for child influencers?
So in California, we have a number of unique entertainment child labor laws that have gone into effect over the last century because of abuses in the entertainment arena with regard to child labor. So a child that's on a television show, for example, the parent would have to get, or the company videotaping the child would have to get a work permit to ensure that the child isn't working over a certain number of hours per day or per week. And then in addition to that, if they're generating more than $1,000 of income, there would have to be a trust put in place so that a certain percentage, 15% of the money that the child makes, goes into a trust that is used for the benefit of the child by the time the child is 21 years old.
Is that the Coogan Act that you're describing?
That's the Coogan Act, which went into place in 1939 and then was sort of made even stronger in the late 1990s.
Right.
And so there are these laws that we have in California. The question is, do they need to be implemented with regard to these YouTube influencers and Instagram influencers? How much money is being made on the platform? Sometimes they're making money from advertisements, but sometimes they're getting free things. Those free things, which might end up making money for them, how do we make sure that they get that money? There are a lot of really interesting, unique legislative, regulatory decisions that have to be made if we were to regulate this industry.
Now, a change to the Coogan Act in California was proposed to cover the, quote, employment of a minor in social media advertising, but the legislation looked vastly different from its proposal when it was signed into law. What can you tell us about that?
That's right. So there was a proposal to regulate YouTube influencers that ended up being very watered down once it was actually passed. And it's not uncommon for this to happen. We have very well-meaning legislators who might propose a piece of legislation, but then in order to get it passed, all of the sort of meat of the legislation gets carved out. And that is because I think in California, we have a lot of fears around scaring off technology companies. So there is a fear that if we were to regulate what YouTube does with regard to its child influencers, or what Instagram does, then they would up and go to another state. And so I think that there's a fear in the California legislature that if we were to step forward and protect children in this way, well, what would happen to those companies? What would happen to the jobs that these companies provide? Would they just up and leave and go to Wyoming?
So
or,
would you like to
someplace
see
where
then federal protections enacted?
I think that this is an arena where federal protections absolutely must be enacted. I mean, we're talking about very vulnerable people. We're talking about children. these are platforms that that federal Congress has been thinking about regulating for other purposes, for antitrust purposes, for labor and employment law purposes. Why not ensure that the most vulnerable people on these platforms are protected? Why would this not be around? We have child labor laws. We have, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, there are child labor protections. Why would we not ensure that that kids all over the country whose images and performances are being monetized on these platforms, why would we not ensure that they are protected?
Now, in a recent article, you're quoted as saying that YouTube has a bigger obligation to its child influencers than it is currently fulfilling, that maybe it should be regarded as a joint employer. What is the company not doing enough of in your eyes?
YouTube supposedly won't give an account to someone under the age of 13, but they're not looking to make sure that the images of people under 13 are being used by other people's accounts, and they're certainly not asking for work permits if children are being images are being used on monetized accounts. And I'm not certain that they are doing enough to make sure that parents are aware of what happens to the kids' images once they are sort of being made publicly available through the YouTube platform. And so some of this could happen through Congress over a long period of time, or YouTube could step up and say, you know what, we're going to be a responsible company here. We are the ones that disseminates the advertising money. We are the ones that make sort of the rules about what to do, what you can't do on the platform, and so we're going to ensure that these kids are protected. I mean, tomorrow they could pass policies, or they can make policies to ensure the safety of these children in the long run and the well-being of the children.
And so, as you mentioned, there are concerns about how the data related to these influencers can be used by companies or other third parties. Especially we know that TikTok is becoming increasingly popular. We know that it's owned by the Chinese government. There may be some question as to what happens to all of the images on platforms like that and other platforms. Is artificial intelligence something that these children and their parents should be worried about?
Absolutely. I mean, there is, Shoshana Zuboff is a sociologist who writes about the rise of surveillance capitalism. I mean, the way that all of these companies make money is by selling images to third parties. And I don't think that we have fully internalized what that means yet, or what it means to consent to doing something like that. So these kids' images are being used both for advertising purposes, and they're being scraped by other companies essentially for artificial intelligence purposes. What does this mean in the long run? How will this impact the children in the long run? There are so many legal, sociological, sort of personal questions. These things are going to have an impact for these kids for a really long time, and we just don't know how.
Right.
Because a lot of it is happening behind closed doors. The companies aren't transparent about who they're selling to, and parents just don't understand.
And as you mentioned, this entire industry, the influencing industry, is relatively new. So is there any way to gauge, or any data we can look at that will show how these children might be impacted when they're older from these accounts that they are spending so much time and energy cultivating when they're younger?
Yeah, I think you've really put your sort of finger on the button here. There is not a lot of data that we have on how this is impacting these young children, how much time they're spending doing this, how it's sort of impacting their sense of selves, their livelihoods, their lives on an everyday basis. The only kinds of data that I'm aware of is we can look at tax records to know how much money the parents are making off of their monetized images from YouTube, and then get a sense of how many millions of dollars are being generated in this industry. But I think a lot of sociological work needs to go into this. Interviewing these these kids and their parents to understand how it's impacting them. And I think it's also going to take time. I mean, with the child stars in the entertainment industry, it took time for us to understand that this has a psychic impact on individual children. This isn't just a job for them in the way that selling newspapers might be a job, or working at McDonald's might be a job. This impacts how they think think about themselves. It impacts their friendships. It impacts sort of their social worlds, and eventually maybe their political worlds. And are they in a position to consent to all of this all of this work?
Especially when you think about the fact that some of these accounts become so lucrative that family members give up their other employment just to pour everything into, increasing the turnout in this child's social media account. So imagine the pressure. If you're that child, you're supporting your entire family.
Absolutely. And what does it do to the parent-child relationship? They need to perform a certain way because it's generating income for the family. And if people are really relying on this as either supplementary or for their full-time income, then I mean, what is this doing to families? What is this doing to, if your dad is both your dad and your boss, and you are generating the income for the family, and you are 6 years old, what is that going to do to you in the long run?
It's hard to wrap your head around. Well, Veena Dubal, we thank you so much for sharing your insight with us.
Thank you.